So Paul Ryan is stepping down as Speaker of the House. And there are a lot of people, I think, on both sides of the aisle who are happy about this, who are experiencing some sense of Schadenfreude that this tool of the establishment is stepping down from his exalted post to either allow the Trump agenda to run free, unconstrained of his hesitation to challenge the forces of the deep state or what have you, or perhaps from another perspective, allowing people who will truly challenge the Trump agenda to rise to the front as the Democrats possibly retake Congress and or possibly retake the House of Representatives in the aftermath of the next midterm. But I you know. I don't understand either of those perspectives, honestly. I'm going to be real with you real quick. Because to me, Paul Ryan has always seemed like a good man. Now, there's a difference between being a good man and being a good Speaker of the House. I don't think he was a terrible Speaker of the House necessarily. But what I observe is that is one difficult job. Because in our current era of divided politics and utter and just pure polarization, it's difficult for anybody to try and occupy a place in the political constellation to foster, facilitate a dialogue between both sides of the aisle, or even between opposing sides in one's own caucus, without being labeled a traitor, a sellout, weak, or whatever the case may be. Now, the different criticisms have to be taken in their own, individual merits. The critique from the right of Paul Ryan, I think, has been that he sold out to the establishment or what have you, and endorsed policies, or at least refrained from supporting certain policies and politicians, Donald Trump key among them, who to some people represent more of the kind of earnest core of the conservative movement or the Republican base or what have you. For anybody who feels that way, I think it's important to sort of step back a little bit and remember this was a man in Paul Ryan who, the guy's always been conservative, right? He's always been a person who's been very clear on the fact that he feels that the role of government ought to be rolled back and moderated so as to allow the United States to grow unencumbered by the burden of heavy regulation and so forth. But he was always willing to work with people from the other side of the aisle on the one hand, and on the other hand, he was clearly never comfortable with a lot of the things that Donald Trump was saying that frankly offended the sensibilities of Americans right and left across this country during his campaign. Of course, for folks on the left, many Democrats and liberals, they have no sympathy with Paul Ryan's policy agenda. A lot of people look at the sorts of policies Paul Ryan advocated for and felt that, well, these are cruel policies. I can understand why a person would feel that way, because there's an argument to be made to suggest that government needs to take a far more aggressive role than Paul Ryan would have had it do. But where I become a little bit miffed is when people assume that just because a man like Paul Ryan has a different policy opinion than they have, that somehow he must not be concerned about some of the same things they're concerned about. Now, frequently, politicians do have concerns that veer towards whatever their own native interest or groups may be, more so than they do to the constituencies of other politicians or other groups, because at the end of the day, we all only come from where we come from. But that doesn't mean that an individual politician may not be trying his or her best to address all the different concerns of different people in the United States of America. And I think that Paul Ryan was was sincerely a person like that. So I remember when he proposed his reform package on entitlements, and people accused him of trying to ultimately eliminate Medicare and Social Security, and the opposition ran this commercial that showed him pushing an old lady in a wheelchair off a cliff or something like that, and of course, cause sort of laugh about it a little bit because it's so far out. But yeah, I mean that's the way people on the left have felt about Paul Ryan, and even for those who felt that Paul Ryan may be a person who has some personal dignity that makes him a little bit better than Trump, but people, particularly people on the left who felt that way about Ryan, I think because they felt that he had some sense of, or at least because they felt that he ought to know better, a lot of folks on the left have felt that Paul Ryan has been the ultimate coward for not having challenged Donald Trump more directly, particularly after Trump was nominated and then became president. And here's what's interesting about that point of view to me. It's the fact that, I mean, it's a valid criticism, because you can look at certain things that Trump has maybe done, certainly certain things that Trump has said, and say that, well, this is beyond the pale. So many of these statements, whether you're talking about things that he said about Mexicans or war heroes or whatever the case may be, you can look at so many of his statements and say, well, each of these should have been, or any of these could have been disqualifying to be president of the United States, and a number of other characteristics or attributes of President Trump, our president, that a lot of folks feel should have kept him from ever entering the Oval Office, and therefore conclude that Paul Ryan should have made it his priority number one to obstruct President Trump at every pass. But people on the left who feel this way, one, are overlooking the fact that Paul Ryan gave less support to President than candidate Trump, Republican nominee for President Trump, than any sitting Speaker of the House, I believe, has ever given to his or her party's nominee during a presidential election. If there's somebody else who was more tepid in their support of their party's nominee, you'd have to point them out to me. It may just be that my history isn't good enough to be aware of it. But Paul Ryan did not campaign for Donald Trump. He said at various times a number of things that were that were clear in their condemnation of the sort of politics that Trump was practicing. And even after Trump has assumed the reins in the White House, it's been clear to me, at least, that Trump's brand of politics, his way of communicating and talking about issues, and a lot of the sentiments he expresses, these don't reflect the way that a guy like Paul Ryan feels about things. But Paul Ryan was also himself in a position to where, well, let me phrase it like this. Paul Ryan is a true believer. I'm not saying that I am necessarily, or that I'm not, but Paul Ryan is a true believer in a free market system and in a conservative worldview, particularly a fiscally and economically conservative worldview, that says that evaluates our current economic station in the United States and says that we are heading off of a perilous fiscal cliff from which there will be no return unless we start practicing a far greater level of discipline than we have been in terms of spending, but also in terms of rolling back taxation and regulations to allow for the actual sort of creative enterprises of American entrepreneurialism to recoup so much of what we've lost in terms of our economic health and wealth and vigor as a society. If you look at the American economy through that philosophical lens, what you see is an ever-expanding federal government taking ever and ever more from the American people, who have the power to sort of create opportunity for all people if the federal government were to allow them to do that. If you're coming into an analysis of the United States economy with that kind of a philosophical perspective, then you can't help but feel, as Paul Ryan does feel, I think, that the great task of a Speaker of the House or any elected official has to be to shepherd the country in the direction of being able to execute the sorts of policies that will deliver her from this impending fiscal doom. And that's how Paul Ryan saw his job. And it just so happened that after working his entire life, his entire adult life, to get to the point to where he could help stave America, to where he could help America steer itself around the iceberg of this potential economic collapse, catastrophe. It just so happened that he would not have been able to do anything as Speaker of the House to sort of advance an agenda along those lines without working with the sitting president, who happened to be Donald Trump. And if you ask yourself, if you were in a position, whoever you are, let's just say you're Speaker of the House now, and you're faced with the moral dilemma. You've got a boss who you think, in to this degree or that degree, is morally reprehensible, or at least that he's said or done some morally reprehensible things. But at the same time, you're in a situation where the nation needs policies that allow it to preserve the promise of opportunity in the American dream for subsequent generations, and that it is wholly possible that without certain key policy changes here and now that you have the power to help usher into place, that it may be all but guaranteed to continue down this perilous economic road. What becomes more important to you? You see, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi don't care about Paul Ryan's agenda to begin with, and neither do most liberals, and therefore it's an easy thing for folks on the left to call him a coward, call him craven, what have you. And again, I sort of get the feeling that says that, well, we would have liked Paul Ryan to have taken a stronger moral stand against some of the things that President Trump has said or done. I can empathize with that all day long. But look at the entire context of this man's responsibility and what it was that he may have been trying to do, even if you disagree with it. Because at the end of the day, Paul Ryan is not and never was like so many of these Democratic and Republican politicians in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere who really are the problem. Politicians who genuinely feel, or at least act as if they feel, that Americans on the other side of the aisle are themselves the enemy just by virtue of them being Democrats or Republicans or whatever the case may be. But when Paul Ryan took the gavel or received the gavel from Nancy Pelosi, he spoke to the assembled members of the House of Representatives, and he said something very clear and along the lines of, we should pray for each other. And when we pray for each other, we ought not to pray for conversion, but to pray for understanding. In other words, he was saying that we ought not to pray merely that people in the other political party come to think like us, but that we come to understand why it is they think the way they do. And that is a recipe for, well, that's a blueprint for building a better conversation, a better political conversation in America nationwide, principle that we all ought to follow. And Paul Ryan, as far as I can tell, always did his best to live up to that example. And so he has been torn down and pilloried by Americans right, left, and center for being a coward, when in fact, he, during the course of his career, has shown more moral courage than most politicians who find themselves in positions of responsibility. He's shown more intellectual honesty than most politicians who find themselves standing up and spouting talking points without ever substantively addressing the real intellectual concerns of opposing points of view. You've never heard him insult or disrespect or demean anybody in any conspicuous or consciously malevolent way, the way so many other pundits and politicians are comfortable and willing to do to serve their own selfish interests. And so I'm not saying that he's a hero. I would have liked to have seen more from Paul Ryan. There was a time when I thought that he might be a promising person to maybe be president. I thought that he could perhaps provide a sort of moral leadership that went beyond mere policy prescriptions. But what he did do, to me at least, was to show himself to be a decent Pardon me, the camera cut off for a second, but I'm just going to keep rolling. Okay, good. Still recording. What Paul Ryan showed himself to me to be, at the very least, was a decent human being in the midst of an increasingly indecent political culture and civic society. And so, like I said in an article I wrote about Ryan, as a matter of fact, I think I'll link to it below if you feel like taking in any more of this kind of this kind of a rant and ramble. One man like Paul Ryan is not enough to save our civic culture. But if all men were like Paul Ryan, then our civic society would indeed be saved, I think. So I say, Godspeed to you, Speaker Ryan, and may even better men follow in your stead, because certainly we need better men and women now than the ones we have been accustomed to, or we need the ones who we are accustomed to become as good as they might have it within them to be. And with respect to Paul Ryan, I think we can say that he did his best to be a better example. And that may not be enough for us right now, but it's not a bad place to begin. And so, why don't we all do likewise? You're watching John Wood Jr. Like, share, and subscribe. This is The Wood Review.